Good afternoon.
Yeah, I'll get it. I'll just
that?
get the door. Just gonna get the door.
Do I need this? Are you hearing me okay? Okay, great. Well, thanks for coming, for being here this afternoon. I'm Frank Wilderson, a professor in African American Studies and Director of Culture and Theory PhD program. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Murillo III, our speaker and job candidate tonight. Dr. Murillo's talk is entitled Black in Time, Untimely Blackness and Impossible Stories. But before I introduce John, I want to thank some of the people in African American Studies who have worked behind the scenes to make this all possible. Let me list them and then we'll give them a collective round at the end. First off is our office manager, Robert Escalante, who has secured all travel and hotel arrangements, as well as been a tremendous help to me in my role as chair of the search committee. Robert has also made it possible for us to video these talks so that faculty members who are here can see them, and students too, but especially faculty members who are going to be voting on this. Next, I'd like to thank my comrades in arms on the search committee. That's Professor Julia Lee of Asian American Studies, Professor Victoria Johnson of Film and Media Studies. Vicki is also a core member of African American Studies, and Professor Jared Sexton of African American Studies. And finally, I want to thank Professors Bridget Cooks and Professor Jared Sexton for the hard work they've put in running African American Studies for the past 8 years. Jared for 5 years as director when we were a program, and Bridget for 3 years as the very first, this is a historical moment. It's one of those Negro firsts, right?
Again.
The very first. It reminds me of that joke. Oh, 500 white folks. You know, what do you do, son? Well, I'm up here. I mow the lawn down to the cemetery. So, every day, 500 white folks. Right? But in all seriousness. Yeah, Bridget has been our first African American Studies chairperson. And really, because of the efforts of Sexton and Cooks, we've experienced 8 years of growth and stability in which the two of them have worked the back channels of campus bureaucracy to help us transition from a program to a department. Bridget and Jared are also behind this particular job search, and the two of them have fostered, as far as I'm concerned, a departmental environment that has helped the African American Studies faculty to be productive and impactful in our publications and our research. So please join me in thanking all the people that I've just named. Okay. Now, on to tonight's speaker. I was on a statewide Senate committee a while back where I happened to meet a renowned UC physicist, who I will not name, see why in a moment. This physics professor on this Senate committee up in Oakland told me that the humanities were a delightful ensemble of disciplines, but he cautioned me about the shelf life of the scholarship that we produce over here. He told me that in a few decades, people like him, physicists, would be able to explain everything about life. If for no other reason than the fact that physics would be able to end the uncertainty that seems to permeate the scholarship of lesser disciplines like those found in the humanities. I'm not laughing, okay? So the fact that this physics professor makes more money than perhaps anyone in this room suggests that there are others nearer to God, who share his opinion. Okay. But I doubt very seriously if tonight's speaker shares the views of the physicists that I met. Whereas all I could do, not being a man of science, was to nod my head like a grateful supplicant as the physicist spoke, and hope that my retirement from the field would come before science conquered the uncertainty of the humanities. I know that Dr. John Murillo III would have had something to say to this man had he been there at that meeting. But also I suspect that Dr. Murillo has to say what he has to say is not on the order of rescuing the humanities or trying to match science's truth monopoly with the hegemony of critical theory. John Murillo would have been able to educate this man without fighting him, show him the ways in which physics can inform critical theory and how critical theory and literary texts can inform physics. I would have loved to have witnessed such a dialogue, for I have seen the fruits of such juxtaposition in John's written work. Murillo's work is transdisciplinary in that, like an intellectual magpie, it engages theoretical physics, Black critical studies, literary theory, and psychoanalysis. His work critiques and interrogates the assumptions theorists as well as lay people make about the ontological relationship between Blackness and time. And his method of conveyance artfully weaves a tapestry of resonances which are academic, poetic, dramatic, and theoretical. Dr. John Murillo, who is currently an instructor at California State University, Dominguez Hills, is a graduate of UC Irvine, where he almost majored in the sciences. That was before he found his way to the humanities, specifically the English department at UC Irvine. He majored in English, but continued taking classes in cognitive science. From UC Irvine, John went to Brown University, where he completed a PhD, again in English, finishing in May of 2016 with a dissertation titled Quantum Mechanics, Untimely Blackness in Black Literature Out of Nowhere. His dissertation is under contract now at Ohio State University Press and will be titled Black in Time, Untimely Blackness, a book which introduces Black time as a problem for thought, and then alerts us to an alternative conceptualization of Black time, untime, beginning with the narratives of anti-Black violence that drove Dr. Murillo to reconsider Black temporality and progressing through a reading of seminal works in Black literature. The monograph lays the conceptual groundwork for an alternative theory of Black space-time. I like to think of it as, among other things, a challenge to the universal applicability, the so-called universal applicability of critical tools of interpretation, such as Bakhtin's chronotopes. The central aim of Black in Time, Untimely Blackness, is to reconsider the stakes and possibilities of Black creation from the street to the page. The upshot, writes Professor Deke Neighbors of Brown University, is a surprising confluence of radical African Americanist aesthetic discourse and recent strands of theoretical physics. The immense appeal of Murillo's work lies in its ability to make connections at a technical level which are more or less invisible to most ordinary literary critics, end quote. Not only is Dr. Murillo a literary scholar and, for my money, a scientist, but he is also a creative writer. In addition to his book reviews, his articles, and the monograph under contract, he has published creative work as well, and had the distinction of being selected to attend an annual creative writing workshop called VONA, Voices of Our Nation, a multi-genre workshop for writers of color, which was founded by the likes of Junot Diaz, David Murrah, D.M. Jones, and Almaz Abeneder. In 2015, the Indiana Review, a journal of fiction, poetry, and creative nonfiction and art, awarded John Murillo III its first prize in its creative nonfiction context. Murillo's Black in Time was the winning submission. Novelist Kizzy Lehman, who was the judge of this contest, had this to say about John's writing, quote, "I've never read an essay that so courageously and really out of necessity blended the mystery, ruthless joy, and temporality of Black life in this country. The piece moves in and out of music, dramatic science, playwriting, and buoyant social critique, not effortlessly, but so effectively. It is one of the most amazing pieces of prose I have read in the 21st century," end quote. Please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. John Murillo III.
right? Okay. Yeah, I'm always afraid of that. But, okay, so this is Black in Time, Untimely Blackness, and Impossible Stories. But first, I want to be as sincere as possible about this. I must open by thanking everyone here for welcoming me with an opportunity to share my work and my thoughts with all of you. I come bearing the sincerest hope that this offering will stir your imaginations and stoke a generative exchange once we're through. Like the forthcoming book from which I adapted this talk, and that title is really tentative. One of the readers asked me to change the title from the dissertation because they think it doesn't make sense. So I'm still fishing that out there. But like the forthcoming book from which I adapted this talk, what I bear across as genres, we will move through narrative, close reading, theorization, and anecdote because, as I say to my students, to my family, and to really anybody who spends their time trying to ask me about my work, I am driven by a need to make this work as accessible as possible to the communities that raised me. Put differently, I speak what's next with my mother's ears, heart, and mind in mind. So there's 3 sections. The first one is called Shattered Beginnings, and it begins with an epigraph from Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks that reads, "The problem considered here is one of time." I do not know when else we might begin, but with an arrangement of fractured endings. Suspended around us, the scattered shards of lost black life and untimely black death play the familiar broken scenes again and again. The countless faces, the names we write on t-shirts, posters, websites, and our own flesh peer through the fragments, expressing a want or perhaps issuing a demand that we black folk who live too intimately with the sharp shards of their shattered existences and bear the inevitable gashes and cuts over and over again reflect upon the temporal bits of them that remain. I do not know how else we might begin, but by carefully submitting to the wounds and to the perils, with assembling and even an inevitably cracked and incomplete mirror from these sharp screens on which these scenes of subjection repeat. I begin this reflection, driven by a very personal but also a very collective need to make time to really see and hold these scattered glimpses of life and death close, feeling, listening, and searching for what these shattered timelines might have to teach us. By carefully arranging all this brokenness, we create a medium to reflect upon the untimeliness of such fractured lives and deaths, and then to consider what this untimeliness teaches us about the violently shattered relationship between blackness, life, death, and time. Really knowing and feeling the relationship between blackness and time has import in and of itself, because a more precise diagnosis of the conditions of black life and death in the anti-black world is necessary if one of our aims is the development of a more precise treatment of those conditions. This is because part of my contention is that a recognition of the unethical, derelict, and deathly relationship between blackness and time shatters our taken for granted ideas about our deeply but really sometimes uncritically held definitions of pastness, presence, and futurity. My contention is also that radically rethinking black temporality will profoundly reshape our relationship to black attempts at creation and destruction. Understanding what it is to be black in time temporally reorients us toward black acts and artifacts of creative destruction and destructive creation by better orienting us to the possibilities, stakes, and impacts of black creative and destructive work. Knowing when we are or aren't shifts our imaginative and imagined relationships to one another, to ourselves, to the work that we do, and to how and why we do it. What and who we build and break, and how, who, and what we move and make reveal what we know and feel about black untimeliness, or what I call untime. These narrative shards and the forthcoming analyses of black literature and scholarship are aimed at unpacking untime as black time, and perhaps much more imperatively, animated by a hope that this conceptualization will rend an opening for a reconsideration of why, how, and what we can and should create from street to page to screen to stage in the name of caring for black folk under such untimely conditions. I do not know when or how else to begin, but I do know that each and every black fragment matters. Here are the entangled arrangements of the ones that I could collect, the ones I hold the closest. I sit with all the bits that I can bear, listening and looking with intent. This is fragment 0, loops. Jasmine Darwin is slammed on the ground in a place of teaching. Shakira is slammed and flipped and tossed and dragged on the ground in a place of teaching. Dejaria Becton is slammed on the ground in a place of teaching outside of a pool because everywhere are the pavement, the fresh-cut grass, the chlorinated waters and salt waters, the asphalt, the wood, the linoleum, the earth, and then the earth, the grounds for teaching. A repeated concussive force of black girls and women slammed to tile, grass, pavement, and earth produces the percussive rhythm behind the over and over again shock and gasp at what we knew, and know we know, and yet learn again somehow each time. That thunderous breath and boom, bumping anew on a loop, letting loose the lessons of a very particular curriculum, the ones and twos of which roll and roll behind the sample of the final words of Octavia Butler's Kindred, and she screamed and screamed on repeat. Boom bap go the black bodies and the beat bangs, don't it? The way the cadence catches hold of and clarifies the sinister meanings of the hieroglyphics on their flesh mixes well with the staccato flow of the narratives that comprise that flesh's text. The constancy of the concussive force, the theft of breath, the break of bone, and the boom of body provides a portion of the key to a praxis and a theory, a text for living and for dying, and a method for reading both as it pertains to delving deeper into the blackness of the problem of time. The way this violence loops, typically as an expression of real bodily concussive force against black female bodies, and that it loops at all, unsettles certain assumptions about the linearity and progressiveness of time's movement. Instead of the proverbial timeline plotted with neatly arranged events along an axis of befores, nows, and afters, and comprising something called a history, time is looped and knotted, unwieldy and impossible to so easily conceive. Just try to envision it. Loops, circles, knots, tangles, and almost indistinguishable strands of events twist into and turn into one another. How the loops circle back into or overlap with one another operates as a function of precisely how and how much these events repeat and resonate with each other. The Jaria's beat loops over into Shakira's, and both loop over into Jasmine's, and all three loop over and into the countless named, unnamed, and nameless beats that boom, bap, and bang the shared rhythm of what continues to emerge as a pressing, peculiar, and singularly black problem with time. In my imagination, what this monstrous entanglement of bodies and brutalities actually looks like becomes almost completely inconceivable. Fragment 35, lapse. My strained eyes aim at a blue light filtered laptop display and stick, quiver, and move on the dash cam and surveillance footage playing over and over again. I am in search of at least questions that might allow for deeper exploration of what Doctor Who's David Tennant, the 10th Doctor, would describe as a timey-wimey problem for thought that mutates with each viewing of this and countless other scenes of black subjection. Video 1, dashboard camera footage. Suddenly, Sandra Bland finds herself stopped on her usual way to work. Suddenly, an officer approaches her passenger side window. Suddenly, the door is open. Suddenly, she is out of frame, but he is not. Where and when is her being? Suddenly, she is in the frame, transmuted into carceral inevitability meant to satisfy his carnal needs. And suddenly, she is removed again. Where and when has she gone? He becomes 2 and then 3. He multiplies as she disappears, or rather dissolves, into the disembodied and timeless fury of black fire manifest in a voice screaming, "All of this for a traffic signal, I swear to God," slamming me to the ground and everything. But suddenly that too is gone. In another video of the same moments from a different angle, we see that she is pinned to the earth, thrown to the ground in a place of teaching too, and we shudder to that familiar rhythm. See. Video 2, jailhouse surveillance footage. Suddenly a jail. She is invisible, again, out of view. Initially, it is unclear where or when we might find her, know her, or feel her presence again. Hours pass, and silently the routine terroristic surveillance of the officers, the exterminator, and the jail nurse persists unabated, the only indication of Sandra's life implied by the lack of disturbance in this routine. Suddenly, they are in her cell, where she hangs from a noose fashioned from a plastic jail-issue garbage bag, strung up over a partition in her otherwise empty cell. We only know this after the fact, and we still do not and will not know or feel or see her here. Suddenly, she is gone, seen. That vacant time, those lapses between Sandra's life and Sandra's death, the questions that remain unanswered or unanswerable, likely met with a silence as crushing and violent as the carceral silence of the surveillance footage, All of that ripples through me as psychosomatic tremors. My right hand anxiously taps the pen against the page that's otherwise blank. Dots appear in disarray in the page's space, forming what I am only able to describe as a clutter of ellipses. They litter the lines with a deranged array of the kinds of false starts, open ends, and loaded silences ellipses tend to signify. Fragment 24, Loss. I have had Time, the Khalif Browder story, a 6-part documentary series about Khalif Browder's wrongful imprisonment and ultimate suicide, paused on my computer for a few weeks now. I know I have committed to bearing witness to the glimpses offered by these black narrative fragments I have chosen to hold in my hands, but here I sit hesitating to hold Khalif in my vision. That he was misidentified for a crime that he did not commit, warehoused on Rikers Island in maddeningly long anticipation of court dates that never offered him even the chance to prove his innocence, spiritually and emotionally devoured by the monstrous machine of the gratuitously punitive justice system, and that he could not bear to live in the aftermath of being regurgitated by that system is almost too much for me to bear. And I can hear his frustrated insistence as my thumb hovers over the spacebar. It took over 3 years of my life. I'm never going to get those years back. He shakes his head and looks off into the distance. Never. Mirroring him, I shake my head and I press play. The gears of a clock spin before us during opening title credits of each episode, reaffirming that the aesthetic choices made by the writers, subjects, researchers, and producers will be guided by a careful attention to the machinations and operations of time. Stylistic dramatizations of time passing, time rewinding, time spinning out of control, clarify the unpredictability of time's violent movement around and upon the life of Khalif Browder, and they reveal the temporal violence experienced by Khalif, his family and friends, the black folk who know of and feel the familiarity and horror of his narrative fragment, and of we who watch and rewatch the familiar horrors unfold over and over again in this documentary series. These visual gambits aim at unsettling the viewer by visually announcing and repeating the temporal incoherence that characterizes what happens to Khalif. The hope, or really the bet, is that these visualizations force readers to recognize, to reckon with, and to feel the incoherence of time's movement here. We who sit and watch are not only meant to bear witness to the way time itself devastates Khalif, his family and friends, and all black folk, but also to bear that devastation in our own imaginations. We must think and feel this subjection to time's unrelenting force. I shudder to the rhythm of the moving gears of the clock on the screen. In my imagination, Khalif remains insistent. I lost my childhood, I lost my happiness. I'm not gonna get those years back, never. His is an insistence of his lost time and of the lostness of his time. That it is lost, how it is lost, and above all that Khalif knows, embodies, articulates, and lives the dispossession of temporality for as long as he can bear. All of these pieces, as well as the insidious kinds of in-betweens betwixt them, both out of terror and out of a lack of available vocabulary, all of this collapses in me with immense density. A gaping hole in me widens, engorging its massive absence with all the numerical measures of Khalif's lost time and what they scream from within. Just 16 years old when the theft of his time began, 1,110 days of wrongful incarceration on Rikers Island, over 800 cumulative days of the mad torture of solitary confinement, 31 court dates that came and vanished in the legal machinery of New York's justice system, 2 years of freedom haunted by the ghost of all that lost time, 1 suicide, countless casualties in the wake of it all, most of all his mother who, quote, literally died of a broken heart. All of the other numbers and percentages that tell us fragments of the grand anti-black story of mass incarceration, all the tick marks and tallies of the slave ledgers, all the years, all the bodies, all the unnameable, irretrievable loss, and can't you feel that? I hear Khalif and I see his face on the screen, at turns appearing defiant, despondent, enraged, disgusted, and lost or at a loss. And I feel that loss in my flesh and in my imagination. I feel like the whole point of me being on this show is just to get my story out there. I feel like this happens every day, and I feel like this gotta stop. I feel like I had to fight. So I am trying to do the impossible, typing the hard words while gently holding these fragments with care. The shards of their fractured black lives seem attracted to one another. I can feel the pull and push of invisible tethers, and I wonder about the texture, strength, and malleability of this unsettling homology, and what gives this force field of fragments its disturbing coherence. David Marriott offers insight into the nature of this force shaping the arrangement of fragments surrounding us. In Ice Cold, the afterword to his dark tome on blackness and visual culture called Haunted Life, Marriott writes of deathliness and its untimeliness. But this is not the sun about to rise in the sky of history, more the intermittent flashes from an underworld of images that happen and keep on happening. What is being witnessed here is a death that cannot ever die because it depends on the total degradation and disavowal of black life. This is no longer death, but a deathliness that cannot be spiritualized or brought into meaning. This is death as nothing less than nothing. As such, this death is never assumable as possibility or decision, but remains the interminable time of meaningless, impersonal dying. Reading a letter Frantz Fanon sends to his friend Roger Tayeb from his deathbed, Marriott meditates on the horror that is the relationship between blackness, death, and time. In Fanon's letter, he writes, "Death is always with us." Death is an interminable, spectral presence, ethically framing the possibilities of, quote, the life of the mind, the life of reason. Life and all its features and capacities must be, quote, answerable to death, and political thought, or rather all thought, bears an ethical responsibility to what he calls the non-representable working of death. Death then frames life itself, and death works through the workful life, demanding that life work with and within its haunting presence. This is an interminable presence, always with us, characterized by blackness's endless proximity to death, endless as a spatial recognition of boundlessness and immeasurability, something like the unimaginable vastness of the ever-expanding cosmos, and endless as a temporal designation of ceaselessness, or timelessness, or so untimeliness. If life and thought are to be redeemed ethically in the end or at the end of one's life, as Fanon would have it, it is within and with death. Bearing witness to the fragments that we struggle to bear, we recognize that blackness is bound up with or by some kind of time crisis. This is why a theory of blackness in time, and also a praxis and a method for reading time, ethically requires the same impossible to redeem bearing witness to death. The deathliness that haunts and works through us, with which we are compelled or forced to work, mutilates or telegraphs a mutilated temporality characterized by infinities and impossibilities, arbitrariness, and gratuitous violence. It resists naming in its indeterminacy, and yet, through the everyday murders of black folk by police force, Rekia Boyd, Ayanna Stanley Jones, Oscar Grant, Michael Brown, Yasmin Vash Payne, Anna Brown, Trayvon Martin, Penny Proud, Deontay Green, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Renisha McBride, Nephi Ardeguin, Sandra Bland, and we bear witness to the mechanics, the loops, the lapses, and the losses of time's activity in relation to black folk in life and death. Time for blacks is a dead and yet undying force, a zombified force and feature of black being, thinking, and living in an anti-black universe, which is, to us, a dead zone, or an underworld, or a cosmos of the dead. This is black time, dead, undying, and deathly time. This is untime. Time loss, time lapse, time loops, time lengths. Time emerges in these untimely narrative bits as a problem for the black lives imperiled by or subject to its peculiar and violent machinations. These parables of the perils faced by black folk in time offer glimpses of what I understand to be a fundamental problem. And by that I mean a problem at the levels of being, feeling, and experience between blackness and time. Stories of the insidious sense that something seems to, at the very least, operate on a different register with regard to time for us, with different resonances and with different outcomes for black living and dying in this anti-black world. After all, what I understand to be the stakes of holding, beholding, and being beholden to these and all the untimely black fragments I am able to bear, and all the ones beyond my bearings, are black life and death themselves. So here we find ourselves, invested in impossible stories about blackness and time. We will delve into Gail Jones's Corregidora and Saidiya Harman's Venus in 2 acts, 2 stories of black lives pushed and pulled by the forces of time in ways that will proffer an alternative and more accurate conceptualization of black temporality. We take Fanon's claim at the top of this section completely seriously. Among the shards we think through time as a problem in relation to blackness. Among the shards, we take the question of blackness in relation to time and center it at the foundation of a larger question about what it is to be, live, and think, and make while black in this anti-black world. So in the spirit of Fanon, and in agreement with his words, let us continue our endeavor, our gathering and arranging of fragments, too late or too early as we might be. Section 2, Black Holes and Revelations. So this is 2 epigraphs, the first one being from Black Skin, White Mask Skin, and the second one being from Hortense Spillers' Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe. So the first one. After having driven himself to the limits of self-destruction, the Negro is about to leap, whether deliberately or impetuously, into the black hole from which will come, quote, the great Negro cry with such force that the pillars of the world will be shaken by it. And then the Spillers one. A female body strung from a tree limb or bleeding from the breast on any given day of field work because the overseer has popped her flesh open adds a lexical dimension. This materialized scene of unprotected female flesh ungendered, offers a praxis and a theory, a text for living and for dying, and a method for reading both. This profitable atomizing of the captive body provides another angle on the divided flesh. With her novel Corregidora, Gail Jones compels us to consider what it means to make generations under untimely conditions. The 4th generation of a bloodline of black women, Ursa Corregidora sings the blues in Kentucky from the mid-1940s to around the late 1960s. Her veins are centuries meeting. The fleshy channels through which the blood, the life force and times of the previous generations of Corregidora women interact with her own, laced with the undying force and time of the surname that they share. The surname Corregidora originates with a Portuguese seaman, slave owner, and whoremonger whose proper name becomes a mystery. He was the master and likely father of Ursa's great-grandmother and the real father of her grandmother and her mother, all of whom transfer his surname from generation to generation. The novel follows Ursa as she grapples with her relationship to Corregidora, to the previous generations of Corregidora women, to the men with whom she seeks love and companionship, and to the history of enslavement and sexual violence and coercion that flow through her veins and bleed into her songs. Great-Gram, Ursa's mother, and Ursa bear Corregidora's name as a generational duty. They must make generations in order to bear witness to the actual violence of enslavement and the actual specificity of the trauma that constitutes their bloodline. The created or procreated flesh becomes a kind of conduit for the lifetimes dramatically bound up with and by Corregidora because it embodies a kind of evidence less vulnerable than their passed down photograph of the slave master, as Graham reveals. They can burn the papers, but they can't burn consciousness, Ursa. Jones entangles the flesh with consciousness. To make generations is to make flesh that can bear witness by consciously accounting for the traumas telegraphed by Corregidora's name, the name as a loaded telegraphic marker, the flesh bearing the name and housing the mind, and the imagination that houses the trauma become inextricable from one another. So what is generated by this process is an entanglement between name and naming, flesh and consciousness, all sutured to and by the undying or timeless or untimely trauma of sexual violence and coercion, itself inextricable from slavery. This generational transference by a generational procreation or creation becomes the subject in question of Ursa's lifetime, of the intimate relationships that influence that lifetime between Ursa, between and among the Corregidora women, between them all and Corregidora himself, and between the women and other men, and of the way these relationships signal another level or kind of horror at the nexus between black flesh, time, desire, and creation. So Ursa bears the name and duty of this complex procreation, but Jones wastes no time throwing this all into crisis. As Ursa leaves Happy's Cafe after finishing a set, her drunk husband, Mutt Thomas, pushes her down the stairs, hospitalizing her, causing her to miscarry, and ultimately resulting in a hysterectomy. No longer able to make generations to continue to bear witness to Corregidora's horrors in the flesh, and perhaps never willing to do so in the first place, Mutt's violence dislocates Ursa from her flesh and blood timeline, as she cannot give continued life and form to her family history and enslavement, and to the name that marks and telegraphs that. Her own flesh, the flesh and blood of her womb removed, embodies or enfleshes a temporal and familial rupture in the flesh and, by extension in Jones's setup, in the imagination as well. It is a rupture of any continuity between past, present, and future, and it is symbolized by what she describes in her own words multiple times as, quote, the door between her legs, or, quote, the hole that she still got. In the wake of the novel's initiating trauma, Ursa's voice temporally and sentimentally shifts. In the time with Mutt prior to her fall down the stairs, Ursa sings, quote, songs that had to do with holding things inside you, secret happinesses, a tenderness, songs of a serenity she hides somewhere behind the words she sings, somewhere, quote, in the tune, in the whole way she drew out a song, the way her breath moved, in her whole voice. Her voice, the way she sings and breathes behind the words, and the songs themselves become their own sorts of text for living and for dying, in which the timeless narrative of the sexualized brutality and violence of enslavement becomes bound up and maybe even counterbalanced with the serenity, the secret serenity Ursa hides behind it. But the traumatic fall down the stairs that disrupts Ursa's relation to time alters the motive behind the singing and so shifts the frequency and alters the shape of the song and its performance. During or thinking about one of her performances, Ursa thinks to herself, I bit my lips singing, I troubled my mind. It was as if I wanted them to see what he'd done, to hear it. All those blues feelings. My voice felt like it was screaming. The temporal and relational break manifests in the strain, screaming through her voice. In her voice, something hardens, a frequency of its expression changing texture, tone, and color due to the interaction of multiple layers of violence in Ursa's imagination and in her flesh. Those for whom Ursa sings key in on this loaded hardness, recognizing it as a hardness that hurts as it is heard. What Ursa suffers initiates a reverse sublimation or crystallization of her voice's essence from an airy and indeterminate something to a tactile, if cumbersome, and more solid something else, capable of both more damage and more resistance. Her blues in this way have become bluer, denser, and the screaming suggests a searing urgency to be heard, paradoxically mixed with a defiant, insistent unintelligibility against which that urgency strains and grows in force. There is an unwieldy blue shift in the blues that Ursa sings. Something moves closer, grows darker, warped by the gravity of the trauma initiating the text. In physics, a blue shift is the result of a condensation of wave frequency. In terms of light, it is the decrease in wavelength and so increase in frequency and energy of electric and magnetic fields traveling through space. Light exists on an electromagnetic spectrum that spans and exceeds what our eyes perceive as visible color, one end of that spectrum marking the red end, think, infrared, and one end marking the violet end, thinking, more ultraviolet, right? A blue shift describes a change in frequency toward the direction of that violet end of the spectrum. Things grow bluer. There are two kinds of blue shift, a Doppler blue shift and a gravitational blue shift. A Doppler blue shift is relativistic in a very phenomenological sense. If the object in question moves at a relativistic speed toward an observer, that object should grow bluer to that observer. And that it grows bluer at all completely depends on the relationship between the object moving and the observer and where their position is, okay? But with general relativity, gravity becomes an additional kind of annoying factor, generalizing the effect to being completely independent of observation. For example, when light particles or photons fall into a black hole or some kind of other gravitational well, they gain energy and exhibit a blue shifting that happens whether or not anybody's there to see it. And if you're anywhere near a black hole, you probably don't see it, right? You might not make it. I'm assuming anyway. This is a gravitational blue shift, and this is absolute. The blue shift of Ursa's blues operates both ways. It is both phenomenological and so dependent on the relative experience of her listeners, and also absolute, structurally occurring independent of one's capacity to see or hear that change. The blue shift in frequency is real in relation to the gravity of the dramatic temporal dislocation Ursa enfleshes, itself enfleshed by the literal and figurative, quote, black hole that she still got. what her relation to time looks like prior to the fall, needs or at least neater temporal alignment of generations past, present, and future warps in the violent gravitational tidal force of the black hole trauma that she bears. What might have been composed of legible markings and names like corregidora or great-gram or gram or mama spaghettifies or atomizes in relation to the gravity of the black hole trauma and breaks down into fragments of letters or lexical symbols or less, so legibility becomes impossible. These atomized remnants stream into the black hole, squeezed and pulled toward oblivion. This is what Ursa Corregidora has made the nude blues that she has generated. Timelines shattered into a stream of legibility, caught up in the time warp of the gravity of unthinkable trauma, made all the bluer by a general blue shift of the, quote, timey-wimey bits that fall into the gravity well. For others, this blue shift is relative, determined by their movement relative to her movement, their hearing relative to the frequency of her songs. How well they are tuned to her singing, which is described as, quote, singing with her whole body. And so how well they are tuned to her flesh and what illegibly springs from and marks it determines whether or not the blue shift will be visible or audible to them. This explains the general illegibility of the music in its essence as the blues, and now as a bluer blues, to those who try and fail to listen and look throughout the novel. The temporal trauma enfleshed by Ursa's brutalized flesh and transmuted into the hard blueness of her songs distort the materialized scene of her saying. Thus, the praxis and the theory, the text for living and for dying, and the method for interpreting them suffer from a bit of frame dragging in relation to the immense gravity of the black hole trauma. That is, they warp at the level of their fabric, their fundament. This scene is overlain text and song is what Spillers might describe as the, quote, vestibule or preview. And if we take the anatomical meanings into account as well, which include in particular the central cavity of the labyrinth of the inner ear, the part of the mouth just outside the teeth, but within the cheeks, and the space in the vulva comprised of both the vaginal and urethral openings, we feel the intensity of the resonance between vestibule and the singularity of Ursa's trauma just a bit more. I read the pre in vestibule's preview to signal a point of conditional, interpretive, and creative entry, the first thing that must be witnessed or heard, the thing that must be witnessed or heard with primacy, the original witnessed or heard thing. Ursa and her blue-shifted blues become text, song. Ursa's distortion of the frequency of the phrase making generations becomes a primary narrative, double emphasis on primary, in which we read an originary theory of black generation making, black generating, black making. Put differently, Ursa as text or song becomes a theoretical performance of creation under untimely conditions par excellence. Being untimely, being subject to a violent destabilization of her relationship with time, undermines the original imposition to make generations that would bind Ursa to a generational duty that begins with and continues the legacy of anti-black sexual violence and enslavement. It blue shifts Ursa's blues toward a radically different form of generation making, of black creation, one grounded in interpretive and performative unintelligibility, undecipherability, illegibility, or impossibility, a text that calls to be read in its illegibility, a song that calls to be heard in its unintelligibility, a form of creation inextricably bound up with destruction. Ursa sings the songs, or the song of her blues, and both performs and issues a blue-hued version of the Fanonian call at the beginning of this section to leap into the black hole of untimely trauma. Leaping into black holes is pretty dangerous work. I think you might know that. It is a pretty deathly endeavor. To do so would be to subject oneself to spaghettification. If you want to ask me what that means later, you can go ahead. To total obliteration. One would be atomized, as Spillers might say, reduced to cosmic refuse, against the kind of making generations that merely reproduces agents that may carry and bear witness. Ursa's blues present a narrative, theory, praxis, and interpretive method for a kind of blue-shifted black creative destruction and destructive creation. What Marriott described as the non-representable working of death might be thought of here as the non-representable working of impossibility. What this fragment of the untimely story of Ursa Corregidora signals is a kind of radical Black creative work that transmutes the impossibility of temporal coherence into an alternative form of making or generation. If Ursa's song is song, and if Corregidora the novel operates as text, to heed the call of Ursa's blues means to follow their template. That is, as Christina Sharp puts it in her essay, Black Studies in the Wake, continuing to, quote, imagine the unimaginable, or, as I might put it here, to make do with the impossible. But really, how do we heed Ursa's call then, and what is our response? How do we take the leap? How do we engage in a Black praxis, theorization, interpretation, and narrativization with impossibility as an essential component? And to what ends if unintelligibility and illegibility seem to be the constitutive to that outcome? And this is the final section called Impossible Stories. There's two very short epigraphs. The first one is from Jerome Dent. He's a former student here. And we had this really long conversation where he dropped this quote to me, and like 5 or 6 years ago, and I've said it maybe 1,000,000 times to myself, because it's well, your imagination can't save you. And then Saidiya Hartman's Venus in Two Acts, she poses a question. What is required to imagine a free state or to tell an impossible story? So on the first and second to last days of a course entitled The Black Fantastic, my students and I tasked ourselves with collectively meditating on the mechanics, stakes, and aims of Black speculative work, literature specifically, horror, science fiction, fantasy, the good stuff, the cool stuff, right? Don't disagree with me about that, at least. But our concerns extended from street to page. In our classroom in the social sciences building at Cal State Dominguez Hills, we thought carefully about the extremes of imaginative invention that gave Black speculative work we encountered its speculative name and qualities. To guide our meditation, we turned to Toni Morrison and Saidiya Hartman, and we spent the class period in assigned readings pondering the nature of this kind of invention. Toni Morrison's Beloved is a multiplied entanglement. Moments in time not together, the ugly twisting of reality's strings. One segment of Beloved's string spans the thread of Margaret Garner's fate. In an office at Alfred A. Knopf, Morrison's longtime publisher, she speaks of her amazement with the horror of Margaret's story after coming across it in a magazine from the Reconstruction era. A slave from the pre-Civil War era, Margaret fled from Maplewood, a plantation in Boone County, Kentucky, pregnant with a daughter in a party consisting of her husband, Robert, her children, and other relatives. Once the group reaches the home of Margaret's uncle in Cincinnati, the party disbands, and Margaret, her children, and her husband remain, while the other slaves escape to Canada via the Underground Railroad. The Garners, awaiting movement to a safe house outside the city, are discovered by U.S. Marshals and slavers and attacked. Robert attempts to return fire, and Margaret, refusing to return her children to slavery and its horrors, kills her 2-year-old daughter with a butcher knife and wounds the others, preparing to kill them as well. For Morrison's novel, Garner's story pauses in time there. Morrison leaving Garner in temporal stasis like that means to be generative, the orders of physical and social death tearing and opening into a void that calls for something like creative invention. In her own words during an interview, she says, "I really wanted to invent her life. I had a few things, the sex of the children, how many there were, and the fact that she succeeded in cutting the throat of one and that she was about to bash another one's head up against the wall when someone stopped her. The rest was novel writing." Morrison's desire to invent life for Margaret Garner aspires for and toward a fiction that might fill in the void created, sustained, and widened by the traumatizing violence of the moment, of Margaret Garner's historical situation, and of the archive, which dulls, severs, and limits what can be accessed by our imaginations. In the wake of the destructive force of the afterlife of slavery, in The Rift, Morrison invents the second segment of the string. The narrative time of Setha as a temporal echo created by Morrison is the product of a process haunted by Margaret Garner's story. My students and I pause right there at this idea of imaginative invention. Through Saidiya Hartman's vision, we begin to examine the recourse to imaginative invention in relation to the fact of historical and political ontological destruction or incompletion. In Venus in Two Acts, Hartman writes honestly and openly about the desire to invent from or with the given and ongoing history of anti-blackness, and the problem that desire or any subsequent invention reveal and create. Venus is a ghostly presence in the archive, mentioned and so offered as a fragment or a glimpse of enslavement, captured only in death, quote, as a dead girl in a legal indictment against a slave ship captain tried for the murder of 2 Negro girls. Countless black girls and women share her name and share the consequences of losing their proper names to blackness and untime. The various Venuses do not have stories of their own, only stories in orbit of them. For them, coherent narrative is impossible. They are only glimpsed in the periphery of, quote, the violence, excess, mendacity, and reason that seized hold of their lives, transformed them into commodities and corpses, and identified them with names tossed off as insults and crass jokes. Their story is untimely, made of, quote, death sentences and a tomb that both kills over and over again and holds the dead in place. Hartman wants to save this incarnation of Venus. She desires to flesh out the ghosts that haunt the illusions and fictions of the archive, but if to even, quote, read the archive is to enter a mortuary, to step into its deathly and deadly untimeliness where, quote, the unimaginable assumes the guise of the everyday, what might or even can we imagine to whatever degree, even tiny, as Sharp might put it, put breath back into the black body. Slavery shatters time's relation to blackness and renamed or really nameless black folk. Untime deadens history, demarcating the boundaries set by black bondage, rendering newness and so something like invention similarly unimaginable or maybe even impossible. What Hartman wants to imagine, and I imagine what my students, what all of us really want to imagine, a free state, a space and time for mourning where it is prohibited, given the annihilating violence of the archive, is impossible. The conditional temporality, or the time of what could have been, is constitutively denied by the methods of available discourse, academic, creative, or otherwise, the symbolic order that sanctions them, and the imaginations that struggle to read and invent in relation to the archive. Retrieval and redress, whether it is finding the names or reviving the dead, is impossible. I see my students' faces, and some are dejected, some are confused, but all their eyes are lost in thought. To write or tell impossible stories is to, as Saidiya puts it, strain against the limits of the archive, at the same time to enact that impossibility bound to it. Further, it is to, quote, amplify the impossibility of the telling, and in our terms, amplify Ursa's scream to deepen her blues. To do this requires something called narrative restraint, the refusal to fill in the gaps and provide closure, as well as an ability to play with and rearrange, quote, the basic elements of the story by representing the sequence of events. To do this demands a recognition of the position of blackness in time as untimely and a willingness to amplify the defunct relation between blackness and time by playing with it. Unlike the playing of masters like Corregidora, seeking to construct, quote, a history and a context for whites by positing a historylessness and contextlessness for blacks, the kind of playing Hartman demands does not play with the dead in the same way. It does not make corpses by disappearing black beings to the fictions and annihilating forces of history, and then dismember those corpses and all their defining features to distribute the parts to wherever and whenever they happen to be needed. Instead, this is a kind of playing that plays with and within narrative restraint, that chooses to recognize that it must remain coded in the ink of reality and the timeless horrors of its names and stories in order to imagine the impossible. Playing in the dark this way is creative only insofar as it might make a way to what lurks in the black hole that continues to threaten us with total annihilation. The imaginative work of invention under these constraints plays with what is by testing and clarifying the violence of the boundaries set by enslavement in order to imagine from this position what could have been and what could be. In other words, the speculative work it performs and produces ventures to leap into the black hole, seeking to work with and through destruction, and reckoning with not only the inevitability, but the possible utility of the destructive force of that gravitationally calls to and positions us. what Hartman and Morrison want to do, fill in the blanks, recover the lost, and breathe life into the dead, stands in relation to the ethical responsibility we bear to venture into the absences and screams of the archive, to read the absences, the fragments, and the screams as they are, and to amplify their status as absences, fragments, and screams. Cayman, one of my students, a gifted MC and hip-hop head who regularly conjures associations between our lectures and the songs he seems to like, raises his hand and begins, as he always does, slowly and somewhere between unsure and secure. That's like you, right? That reminds me of that one Kendrick song from Good Kid, Mad City, You, right? Where Kendrick screams at the beginning and all throughout the song. Yeah, and all throughout the album too, he uses that scream in a lot of songs, like he's in pain, McConan adds. Like there aren't words for it. Childish Gambino does it in Baby Boy at the end too, just screaming. Tijuana interjects and redirects the line of inquiry very necessarily a little bit. But what about black art by black women? Like Janelle Monáe's Come Alive, when she screams and when she's singing the chorus, when she's singing the title and her voice changes. But what about when it's not in music, like Dana at the end of Kindred, and she screamed and screamed, Phillips asked. They continue to share, but they also turn to me for some kind of affirmation or to supplement their associations with something else. But before I do, like I always do when I'm teaching, turn and check the clock to find that for the fourth or like fifth time this semester, the clock that usually hangs behind me is yet again not on the wall. But yeah, this is a real thing that happened all the time. But in the corner on the counter next to the sink, dead or maybe broken or maybe just wrong, but otherwise discarded to the periphery. I sense, and I know we're probably out of time, and while I can offer no solace to them, I linger and I listen and I let them continue as through their questions they dive deeper and deeper into the dark, taking the leap, heeding the screams, boldly going with no time to spare. Thank you.
Will you take questions?
No, I won't take it.
Bridget asked the last time, so I think I should ask. Okay, so we have some time for questions and interventions, so let's jump to it. Well, I'll start off while people are pondering. I was really intrigued by when you brought in physics with your analysis of Corregidora, and when you said when you brought in the physics word blue shift, and then I saw it in my mind as a blues shift. So there's this kind of cross-pollination between the singing and the science. It's just an association, but that's not the question. The question is, could you amplify a bit more about your relationship to science, however you want to put that in? What it's doing for you? What is the utility of it in your critical theoretical interventions and your literary interpretations?
That's a good question. When I first started presenting this project to people as a grad student, it sounded like I was a crazy person and that it was a really bad idea to mix science with English and science with critical theory, and in a way that wasn't just, this is neat, here, look at this, like in a way that actually seemed to generate some kind of reading or generate some kind of interpretive practice for me. So part of this came about as like a sort of defiance, like I wanted to make it happen. But the utility of the science comes from a long-standing interest and an original pursuit of science as my initial major, my initial career track. I was going to be in cognitive science. I was into neuroscience and research and neurological questions about the mind and the body and the relationship between the two. And I sort of jumped ship and went to English at the very last possible second. So I kept those things alive. And the science helps me see that there is a connection between what the physical phenomena of the universe look like, act like, what their mechanics might be, and the theoretical questions, very theoretical questions that we have about things like black holes. For example, there's this information loss paradox about what happens to information that's thrown into a black hole, right? Based on several interpretations that could be really generative to the work, right? The ones that stand out to me are, for example, if you throw a sort of quantum system into a black hole, it's permanently lost. The information is permanently dissolved. It can't be retrieved. It doesn't radiate out or whatever. But theoretical physicists know that black holes tend to evaporate, and they radiate out energy over time. You know, that's why when people were sort of scared of the Large Hadron Collider and the idea that it would produce these tiny black holes, right? They evaporate really quickly, so it's like infinitesimal. They don't really even exist, right? So black holes, larger black holes act the same way, just over a long period of time. And so the idea would be like, well, if they're devouring information and they're spewing out radiation, and it's proven that they seem to generate maybe some heat as a process of that, and they return to their original mass, maybe they're not just permanently losing the information, maybe they're sending it out again. And it's not really completely lost, but it's transformed into like particulate refuse. But that would violate certain principles, right? And that's, I think this ongoing question has been generated from my work because I've thought about what it is to lose information, and not necessarily in a way that I'm going to resolve it, the way that they're trying to resolve it through equations and proofs and observation and whatever, but in a way that seems to lend itself to ideas of impossibility, unintelligibility, undecipherability that are actually like really related to what I think blackness, the relationship between blackness and literature. And I think there's a really good sort of lost connection that's not really being explored too much there. And I don't want to be the only one doing that. I mean, it's cool to be somebody that's like kind of doing that, and there's maybe like a few other people that I know that are trying to do physics with blackness, right? But it's a lost conversation, and I think the utility of the science, or even asking about the utility of the science, or seeing if it could work, is something that's not really being done. And I think that's something that could really prove to be an innovating force for what we're doing here. We do have really strong resonances, and I don't think they're accidental or purely metaphorical with what's happening in the universe. So,
I see Michael, then Jerry.
This is impossibly trivial after what you just said. But so that Ava DuVernay, right, is the movie Wrinkle in Time is coming out, I guess, in a couple weeks. But in her TV show, Queen Sugar,
yes.
it resonated with me because there are two characters, Violet and Blue. And Violet, we're told at the beginning, cannot have children and adopts Blue. Blue is taken from her. And when Blue is taken from her, we learn that she has lupus, which in the context, I mean, I was just thinking in the context of her talk is kind of like she then becomes sick with her body kind of turning in on itself and devouring itself. And the TV show is obsessed with time in a really interesting way. So all this is just a small footnote to say, check it out, because there's something going on in that show that resonates with what you're saying.
I have an essay about it.
On Queen Sugar?
Yeah.
No kidding. Fantastic.
Yeah, I wrote about it, but I didn't actually do any work on the time angle, because I'll go back and look at that, because that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way. I thought of like sort of the more, maybe got caught up in some of the more like surface level questions about space and the plantation and reclaiming a space or owning a space or carving out a space and stuff like that. So, which resonates with the rest of my work. But yeah, I hadn't thought about it from that angle. I'm always going to be binge watching and rewatching shows, so I'll probably go back and check it out.
Where's your essay coming from?
Oh, it's not even done yet.
Oh, you're
yeah.
writing it now.
Yeah, it's just about done. I wanted to rewatch the finale again and add some more stuff to it. But it might be through this literary magazine called Those That This. Yeah, they might publish it. So.
Yeah, I guess one part of this is an observation. And I'm trying to wipe my nose because it started bleeding from the altitude that you put us to.
I'm sad for that joke.
I'm picking myself up.
Glad you said that.
I mean, I just had to say that. We're like, you know. But depending on whose work you're consulting, I'm thinking of the image of leaping into the black hole. So you leap into you don't actually leap into the black hole, you leap into the event horizon.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And your image freezes right there. And that's the last thing that is perceptible. The image just fades over time, a kind of elongated, right, temporality. And it fades into a blue haze as it disappears. But the atomization that you referenced is underway, right? That's what actually annihilates you, is like you get spaghettified, as you were saying, right? Turned out into a string of atoms. Not the best way to go. But
No one will even see it.
no one will even see it. But that suggests to me that there's this junction between perception and experience that you've brought us to in thinking about the untime, black time. That there's a break between the perception, right, of that leap and the experience of it, which might be linked again to what you're talking about, the illegibility that begs to be read, the unintelligibility that begs to be heard. But it also seems to say something about how you are discussing writing, and this is the question that I had. I heard you say in the first section early on about black creative and destructive writing. And I stopped. I wanted to press pause, but you were doing it live, so I pressed pause to think about it. But something happened when I was listening to you say this about creative and destructive writing, because we talk in warm and affirmative ways about creative writing every day. We love creative writing, but we have never talked about destructive writing in those terms. It's a pejorative sense. This is destructive, what you've done here. Right? Give creative, constructive. Yeah. So to think about destructive writing as a genre, or as a mode, or a register, in a way that's non-pejorative, right? It also has the effect of changing how we think of creative writing.
Yeah.
As something that's not simply affirmative and celebratory,
Yeah.
right? But these two being entangled in a certain way.
Right.
So that one can set out to do a creative work and manage something destructive, and vice versa.
Yeah.
The leap into the black hole, which you said threatens us with total annihilation, is also that which presents the possibility of connecting us to everything else
Right.
at the point of singularity, right? I mean,
Do you
Christopher
remember-
Nolan tried to do this in his way with Interstellar. It's a black film in white face, right?
Yes.
Yeah, right, after hearing you talk. But if we thought of it that way, right, into the black hole, which threatens total annihilation, guarantees it, actually.
Right.
But also presents this singularity which connects you to everything else, all those threads that you were talking about.
Yes.
And the kind of derangement of the temporal orientation that we typically carry at the same time.
Right.
You can riff.
No,
if you want. This,
Did anybody know what singularity is?
that's a good place to start.
Okay, so it's theorized to be like the center of a black hole, right? But it's really also in mathematics like where the math fails completely, where it's undefined or it cannot be completed, right? And that's become part of the issue with trying to figure out exactly what a black hole is, because once the light stops radiating out, there's no way to get beyond that point. There's no information that's coming out, so you can't ever find out unless you were to go into a black hole, and well, you're not coming back most likely. I don't think it's going to work out like Interstellar did,
Right.
where you magically end up in the future or whatever, right? But yeah, I think it's a very generative concept in that way, because if I'm saying that this is a call to do that, Fanonian call or Gregorian call or whatever, to leap into the black hole, toward something that is completely undefined, there's an infinite amount of peril, and there's an infinite amount of possibility mixed up with each other. And any theorization of creation, or for me, of black creation that does not attend to both of those things, fails completely to me. The math fails. Right? I think I don't have an answer to whatever the outcome of that is supposed to look like, or the best version of it is supposed to look like. I'm not here to say, oh, there's black art that does this better than other black art. I think that's like a facile kind of set of judgments, and I'm not interested in that conversation. But I am interested in the pursuit of seeing how far we could possibly push that envelope. Right? How far could we leave if we took that very seriously? We took destruction very seriously and not just thought of it as something consequential or probably peripherally bad, an unwanted consequence of something that we tried to do otherwise, right? A creative thing that accidentally had some kind of creative crap that came off of it, a destructive crap that came off of it, and we didn't want that. No, like maybe this is constitutive to what we're doing, and maybe that's the point, and maybe we're only touching half of the story right now, or less, right? And I think that's where black holes are extremely fascinating and extremely terrifying to me. But yeah, I really dig the comment.
Thank you for your talk. I wanted to say something also about black holes because I remember, I think it was in maybe 2004 or 2005, there was this kind of change of perspective in thinking about black holes, so that for most of my life, I was taught that black holes were places of nothingness. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly, in 2004, 2005, 2005, a couple of publications came out that said they're actually everything. Mm-hmm. And so it was this really exciting time to think about this, but also a really strange thing. Like, how does blackness go from being nothing and everything? Yeah. But also, I think what was really interesting about that moment was that it totally made sense socially. Like, how can we be nothing and be everything at the same time? And I think we actually have answers to that. So it made sense that the black hole was something that suddenly made this switch, and there was this kind of nervousness about it. Like, what does it mean? So I was just going to ask, I guess there's lots of things to ask about that, but if you see that I guess if you could, in your estimation, account for that oscillation or the tension around blackness is nothing and everything,
yeah.
And how you maybe see that in the literature that you're really interested in, how authors are playing with that tension, that we're nothing and everything at the same time.
Oh, if I can have an epigraph or a comment. There's a quote that I thought of as soon as you said that, from the recent book, The Ministry of Utmost Happiness. Does anybody check that out? It's really good. It's a very strange but very interesting book. And then one of the key parts, there's a poem written in the book on a gravestone, but it's also printed on the back, so it's not like a spoiler or anything. But it was, how does one tell a shattered story? By becoming everything? Or everyone? No, by becoming everything. Right? And I thought that was such an interesting idea, that there was some kind of weird relationship between brokenness and everything. Mm-hmm. That when you have something that's broken and shattered, it's dispersed across more space. It's dispersed in a way that almost expands it in some ways if you take into account the field of the whole arrangement. It's not just less than what it was. Maybe it's even more than what it was. Mm-hmm. And so I see this question kind of dealt with a little bit right at the end of Kindred, Octavia Butler's novel. And I teach it all the time. And the ending, sorry if you haven't read it, her arm, after time traveling, her arm is stuck in the wall, and she has to pull it out. Like, her arm became sort of part of the structure, right? And when she pulls it out, there was something about that break that seemed to initially result in like vacuuming all that she had been through, all that she had done, and almost invalidating it by recognizing that she could never be whole again, that she could never be complete again. But then we get this weird little epilogue that initially I really, really, really hated. I wrote it in my book. I hate this epilogue. This is the worst epilogue of all time. It's not true. I was just salty at the time. But there's a search that happens after the breaking happens. There's a search that happens after like the total annihilation of everything she thought she knew about herself, of everything she thought she knew about history, of everything she thought she knew about relationships with her husband, everything. Right? And all of a sudden it generates a search for something else. And I think that really embodies that weird relationship between Or at least between being broken and being broken open into something, being available to possibility while still being imperiled by those possibilities. So I guess that's my immediate reaction to your question. But yeah, it's something I'm actually thinking about now for my, so technically it would be like the third project I'm working on, about specifically the information loss paradox and black holes, and this question of like nothingness mixed with everythingness. Or I think I had stylized it before as like nothing mixed with infinity. Like what happens when something is both things, or when something is, you know, like you said, oscillating. I think that's a good word, oscillating between both things in a way that's not really measurable or accountable. So I'm pursuing that now, but it's something that I'm only kind of noticing just now. So.
Thanks.
Oh, yeah.
It's a camera, right?
Yeah. So like I really suck with like STEM stuff, so I kind of want to touch on like the untimed concept that you were trying to explain to us. Now, one of the things I want to say is that like I feel one like close up belief I hold to myself is that like the biggest legacy a person leaves after they die is the ideologies that they imprinted on the world. So although that person may die, we kind of preserve their memory by the words and actions that they share with us while they were still here. And with that being said, I kind of want to go into a little broader what you were saying about him. So like, personally, from my point of view, I remember when I watched the documentary on him, sort of like his interviews like post-incarceration, it kind of seemed like he came to maybe like in agreement with himself, within himself, as far as like whoever Khalid Browder was pre-incarceration, that person is no longer here. Right. Yeah. It's kind of like he died within his 3 years of being in that cell. Somewhere at that point in time, the real Khalid Browder died, and whoever was here now was kind of like the shell of who he was originally. Yeah. And even with that being said, I kind of want to go into what you said, like deathliness over death. Now, also referencing what you said about black fragments. So although Khalid Browder died and he lost him to suicide, you know, those kind of fragments of whatever he said to us and whatever he experienced are still here, and you're still feeling the residual effects of that particular violence that was imposed upon his body. Right. It still felt throughout the world. So, although now I start to get this idea that although Khalid Browder was susceptible to social and literal death, it's at the same time, contrastly, it's kind of like a contradictory effect that he's also exempt from death. Because the experience and the violence that he experienced on this earth are still residual, they're still felt by the world. He's not allowed to pass comfortably into the next life or some afterlife. Whatever you may believe comes after death. Right. He's actually exempt from that. So I kind of just conjure this idea. It's not really a question, but like I kind of conjure this idea when your concept of saying like deathliness over death. It's like you can experience social death and literal death, but within the realm of blackness, you can't die at the same time.
Yeah, it sort of elongates the process, and you know, I think that's part of the really tragic thing about Beloved. You know, reading Beloved, a ghost story. You know, the idea of a ghost in and of itself is like a temporal problem, a timely problem. I mean, it's like the past that hasn't gone away yet. It's still alive. It's a faded version of itself, right? And it's still stuck here. And there's a ghostliness to Cody's story that is, for me, very devastating and very unfortunate. And he's definitely not the only person, right? But that time part really resonated with me. And the end of Beloved has us, you know, the ghost leaves. Right? That's sort of the mini happy ending. All of a sudden, the ghost leaves. Things have sort of been like figured out. But then there's that last 2 pages where there's someone speaking, and it's, you know, the refrain is, "This was not a story to pass on." You know, they forgot about her, or they, you know, they saw her in dreams and tried to discount the dreams. This was not a story to pass on, or this is not a story to pass on, right? And I read that. I read that in the book that I just about to turn in, with that idea that, you know, the ghost is not allowed to pass on, but at the same time must be shared as some kind of example or warning or you know, something in between those two things. And it's a danger I think Saidiya Hartman kind of deals with a little bit when she sort of questions the utility of sharing spectacles of violence in a different way. But it made me think of that because there's something about, you know, sharing the ghosts that is, there's a potential danger to subject them to new violence, as CBA says. And at the same time, they have lessons for us. They're asking us something. They're insistent about something like Khalif was in those videos. And it's just a hard bind to be in as a Black scholar. You know, when you're writing about abstract things sometimes, but you're writing about very real things and real people and people that are definitely still around a little bit, you know, and you want to respect them and you want to, you know, you want to make use of them in a way that turns them into material, right? But you also want to use them in a way that continues that legacy that they left, and whatever that legacy is. And it's a tough place to be in to write from that position. And I think Saidiya does a really good job of talking about how it's hard to do that. And that's been really on my mind as I write about all this stuff. So it was a good comment.
Okay, John, unlike where you teach, our clocks actually work, unfortunately. But I'm going to let Jared have the last small question, and then we'll have to call time.
Not even a question. Just to say that the deathliness that you're citing and drawing from what Marriott's work, to be consigned and imprisoned within that deathliness is also to be given access to it.
Yes.
If you want to put it in those terms.
Sorry, Jared, can you say it again?
The deathliness that Marriott talks about, which John was citing, right? It's to be consigned and to be imprisoned by it.
Yeah.
Because one cannot die, because one cannot live.
Yeah.
So the cycle of living and dying is foreclosed, right? Unavailable.
I see, yes.
But as one is confined or imprisoned to this interminable dying,
Yeah.
this deathliness, one also has access to it.
Yeah.
And I think one of the effects of it is it's no protection whatsoever, quite the contrary. And it's not to say we can't be killed. Of course we can. That's what happens to us in a characteristic way.
Yeah.
But it is to say we don't die.
Yeah.
We multiply. That saying is not about reproduction. It's about fragmentation. So thank you for that.
Well, Dr. John Murillo III, thank you very much for this talk. Appreciate it.
Thanks again, everybody. It's not often you get